It's clear now that the WHA Winnipeg Jets changed Major League Hockey unlike any other team of the 1970s. Bobby Hull and a flood of European talent pushed the game forward, and the Jets flew to 5 WHA finals in 7 years, winning 3 championships. I talked with WHA veterans about the legacy of the mighty Winnipeg Jets.
But I don't think the fans today, nor the players today, really give Bobby Hull the credit he is due for really helping establish the WHA.
Well, I mean, he was the first true, I guess, superstar to leave the NHL with a choice.
Bobby Hull was a superstar, one of the best players in the National Hockey League. Fast, rocket shot, matinee idol, you name it, he was it.
The Bobby Hull story has to be one of the most exciting stories in sports. Hull is probably the most idolized player the game has ever known. After 15 record-filled years with the Chicago Blackhawks, Bobby Hull joined the World Hockey Association by signing a multi-million-dollar contract that made sports history.
And as the WHA came along and they were going about their business, offering contracts to NHL players, trying to move as many name players as they could to the league, I think it was really when Bobby Hull signed his contract that everybody went, wow, this is for real.
The signing, I mean, obviously, that was the best $1 million ever spent by hockey anywhere at any time, and I mean, it gave the league credibility.
Well, I think Hull's magic, his draw, his appeal, his talent really sold the game. In the WHA, you had a chance to see somebody that you couldn't see before. You'd only read about Bobby Hull. Television was nothing like it was today.
And he is such a larger-than-life character. I mean, he's got that raspy voice that he goes, "Hey kid, what's up?" And he's just larger than life.
It was a great selling point for the league, and even during warm-ups, that grin of his. To see that grin in the warm-up and to know that's him, that is Bobby Hull. Fathers pointed this out to their kids. You're seeing him. That's the guy right there.
His shot was something that really was scary. I mean, and the equipment back then wasn't very good, and so not just for the goaltenders, for the defensemen and everybody else, and he would shoot it. I mean, he would blast it from anywhere and everywhere, and so there was a lot of 100+ mile-an-hour pucks flying around when you're on the ice with Bobby.
I can remember seeing Bobby Hull after a game, standing in a spring, cold, chilly rain, signing autographs until every last person had what they wanted.
So I played against him when he was in Chicago and I was in Detroit, and I think actually I think he played his best hockey in Winnipeg. I mean, a lot of his highlights in Chicago are the big shot. I mean, his highlights as far as playmaking and working with line mates. I mean, he had a great line in Chicago, but I think you'd see more highlight films from his WHA career than you would if you're going to show highlights of the likes of Mario Lemieux and Wayne Gretzky and those type of highlights.
There's no question, because I remember playing against him. He loved the game and still loves the game. You can see that whenever he talks about it. But he was that force on the team. There's no question he was a leader, and he could mix with that European style so well. He liked to weave and come and go, and of course he kept you pretty honest with that shot.
Well, the game was beginning to change, and the WHA was leading the way in those changes. When you had Hedberg and you had Nilsson and you had Hull on one line, and maybe Lars-Erik Sjöberg starting the rush, things were going to develop pretty quickly. Defensemen found themselves back on their heels, in a heartbeat.
They had a lot of Swedish hockey players. The European hockey players were so talented, as they still are. I think you see now in all the NHL teams, at least almost half of the roster in each team consists of European hockey players. And when they came over, we could see this talent. And if you were able to get it together in one team, that made it even more difficult.
And they had Sjöberg on defense, who to me played like Pierre Palat. He just controlled the whole game for them, and the Europeans, they fit right in, and they didn't fit right in. They were exceptional hockey players, and the WHA gave these guys a chance in Winnipeg, and boy, oh boy, I think the NHL would have had their hands full if they had to play against the Winnipeg Jets.
I think the fellow that was instrumental was a Dr. Jerry Wilson, was responsible for bringing them to the Swedish contingent. And I don't know, there might have been some Finns there too. Finns, there might have been a couple of Finns, and you know, I mean, it was another big opening to the league. I mean, they were great hockey players. They competed, you know, and they complimented Bobby for sure, or he complimented them. You know, they just worked very, very well together, and it made it exciting, not only for their own fans, but fans around the league that had a chance to watch them play. They were great athletes.
I've never played with two greater hockey players than Alfie and Anders, and they've made the game fun for me and kept me in the game, I think, for 3 or 4 years.
And the game started to metamorphose from those players. And what I mean by that is, as a defenseman, the normal play would be gain a red line, no play, dump it in, and then bump and grind and fight for it. And what was happening, Winnipeg was at that time experimenting where instead of giving you the puck, dumping it in, they would basically throw it back to what we call a neutral zone defenseman, usually Schoberg at the time. Then they would wheel and turn and at high speed receive another pass. So it was a constant kept the defense, myself, on edge, not knowing just exactly whether they were attacking or not. And they were very effective. And as a result, other teams started to emulate that.
But yeah, I think the first guy to pick up on it was Glenn Sather in Edmonton. He liked the way they played, and he had his teams playing that way. And if history is any judge, I mean, you just look at what's transpired in that organization over the number of years. So,
anytime you have a player like Bobby Hull, or say even today when you've had players like Wayne Gretzky, or even the modern day players, most of the strategy on the other team's dressing room is trying to figure out what they're doing.
Put them on the power play. They knew exactly what to do and how to move the puck. And what we call a stretch pass now, were breakaways with those guys. So you had to be very ready for the one-on-ones.
And so there was many times in practice on the chalkboard, we were trying to design ways that we can compensate against this attack. And as a result, we started to change our game too on the way we defended against it to prepare and try to prevent them from accessing our end at ease.
At the time, most of the players were from Sweden or Finland. They were, or you know, they weren't Russians or Czechs, and they had more of a freewheeling style of play, and for a defenseman to get you fits, because they would, you know, play very untraditional. They'd be circling in their own zone, and they'd be coming at you from a lot of different angles.
We'd always try to get physical with that style of team. Try to get them slowed down before they did get wound up, so to speak. And the worst thing you always worried about, especially if you're playing there, if they got a couple quick goals or something, then you're in probably for a long night.
Well, with the Europeans, they played a different game. They didn't play as much north-south as they did east-west. A lot of drop passes. They didn't shoot the puck a lot until they were in real close. And certainly I remember playing Bobby that first day, and I think I was halfway to the blue line when he came down the wing with the puck. But I certainly learned very quickly there was no point in that, because it was not Bobby Hull with the big blast off the wing anymore. They moved the puck around so much that you had to worry about Bobby coming back door for a slick pass from one of the Swedes.
The Winnipeg style, that circling Russian kind of style of movement, was, to some degree, was frustrating to play against. You know, because especially if they got it going, once they got the momentum going.
Well, put it this way, you didn't give the puck away. If you gave the puck away, you weren't going to get it back until the other team finished, whether it was the Jets or the Nordiques. So, and you had to be able to skate, and you had to be able to, if they had the puck, use your head out there, because they crossed, they went north, south, east, west, they recycled, they did things that weren't in the hockey book at that time. And it was a learning process. And you know what? The Quebec guys like that speed, that run and gun game. And I was an English guy, but I could skate, and I had a feeling for this expression of the game. But you had to be, all of us had to be at the top of our game, and you couldn't be mentally slow out there. mental fastness was the biggest criteria as skating.
They were never on their wings, hardly. They'd come in with, we call it the Swedish swirl, and they'd pick up the puck, and Bobby, you know, could go up and down, and they finally get the puck to him, and he'd let that big slapper of his go. But, and move the puck. They were much like probably the Detroit Red Wings are today, very much puck possession.
And certainly the Detroit Red Wings of today are the prime example probably, and they certainly have a lot of Europeans, they have a lot of Swedes, and they don't like to give the puck up. They want to hold on to it for the whole game because they figure that's the best way to play defense is by not letting the other team have the puck.
They were going through drills and exercises that we in Canada never thought about.
Because it goes back to the 72 Summit Series, Canada versus Russia, two different styles of hockey, and I think we found out real fast that theirs was pretty good and pretty effective as well, and I think it was phenomenal for the development of hockey. Not only all of the Europeans that came over here with their talent, but also changing the way that the game was played. A little bit more patience, a little bit more regrouping in the neutral zone, not giving the puck up as much, and we see a lot of that today.
And I think they wore a lot of teams out because we ended up spending half the game just chasing the puck. And so it has. There's no doubt about it that the European influx has changed the game.
When Hull shoots you, you hope you're not in front of it. But yeah, it's difficult to keep it in perspective that this is my job and I'm supposed to try to stop these guys. But when Hedberg and Nielsen and Hull got rolling, boy, it was fun to watch and tough to stop.
Well, no one recognized by any means what great players that Nielsen and Hedberg were. So that's part A. Bobby Hull had established himself as the premier player in the league, and we kind of all learned a way to deal with it. You know, we could kind of send 10 guys at him and corral him, let him have 5 goals, and we'd try to win 7-5. But when you added Nielsen and Hedberg, you didn't know where to go. Plus their defenseman, Lars-Erik Sjöberg, they overwhelmed people.
Years ago, I used to think they had just the talent, but they're physically strong too.
It's a sad thing to say, but the Minnesota team, with so many rough and tough and maybe intimidating, well, they were definitely very intimidating players, they tried to intimidate them. But to win up, or to the credit of the Jets, but in particular, Nielsen and Hedberg and Sjöberg, they couldn't be intimidated. They just kept going, and they would take all the abuse and keep pumping goals in, and eventually they got the point across, so you couldn't intimidate them. And, you know, they're gonna, if you make mistakes like that, they'll fill the net.
Those guys, you know, had people running at them to try to see how they would stack up, and they certainly didn't back down at all. You know, they were really fine hockey players.
We would try to just physically probably abuse them a little more than the other guys because we didn't figure that they could stand that. They weren't used to it, so, you know, in front of the net we'd maybe chop at them a little more, and we might, the Canadian players, so to speak, and guys that maybe are used to that.
Well, I think that the one thing was that it proved they were tough enough in that they were able to absorb a lot of punishment out there, and they didn't give a lot back, but they were able to absorb it, either avoid it and play with it. And I give them a lot of credit because Nielsen and Hedberg in particular took a lot of abuse, but they seemed to be able to adjust their game or avoid the check and continue on.
Well, I think definitely they were being tested. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I think from my standpoint, I know that's when we had a pregame, we'd say, you know, let's hit them. Let's see how tough they are. And I think Winnipeg and a couple other teams that had the European players, they tried to carry a couple guys that were could kind of stand up for them, so to speak, if need be, and which was fine. I mean, that was all part of the game, so it wasn't any big deal really.
The number one reaction that day was, you know, just hit them. I mean, hack them, do whatever you can. I mean, bring them down physically, you know. And, you know, they didn't really fight back, which was unfortunate that people would take advantage of that, because some people that weren't very physical would play physical against them.
One of the WHA referee, Bill Friday, once told a story at the beginning of the game, he called 5 major penalties against the Minnesota Fighting Saints, and none against the Winnipeg Jets, who they just beat upon, and again, the European players, etc. But, you know, they got like 7 goals. It was 7-0. So that was the lesson that they provided. They said, you can't afford to do this to us. So we had a tremendous amount of respect for them.
It was hard to hit them because of their skating skills and their motion. You know, you really, I mean, you know, it was probably the wrong thing to do. You're probably been better off to just shadow them and try to keep them to the outside and do the things that were going to work for you better defensively. Because if you're taking wild runs, they let the puck do a lot of work. I mean, you may get close to them, but the puck's, you know, in another hole, and then you're out of position and you're in trouble.
It was great for Hull. I mean, you know, he was an open, free skating guy, and actually, even though Gordy was, you know, pretty traditional in a lot of ways, I think Gordy could have. I mean, if you Gordy got going and he started playing that kind of style a little bit himself. You know, I think that played into the ability for Gordy to play as long as he could. You know, that he started to realize that he could just not to stop and go so much, but just keep that motion going.
I guess it'd be like a pitcher in baseball that come up with a new pitch, and their attitude was different than what the game was being played. So, you know, they had 3 or 4 different things going for them.
You know, you had to be on the top of your game, and you had to be very disciplined, because they brought an entire new theory to how they moved the puck. You know, with Nielsen and Hedberg and Hull and Schoberg on defense, it was just outstanding to watch. And you could get caught up in watching rather than figuring out how to stop them. But it was an exciting team. It was great for the league, and they were all really tremendous people.
Yeah, I think they did a lot for European hockey players, and you know, I'm not sure the NHL would have been as quick to, and the Detroit Red Wings and people like that, to go over and really look for the talent that's over there. And obviously, there's no question about it now. But as the skilled players got into the game, it was like, and then withstood it. I mean, you know, and had careers. That was the other thing, is, you know, will they last, or will they hang in there and fight for, you know, the close games? And they obviously did.
You know, they had a pretty good defenseman that played in the NHL with the St. Louis Blues that jumped over. Larry Horning was a guy that helped them get the puck out of the danger zone and cleared things away.
The one that gave me absolute fits was a player by the name of Kent Nielsen. He was so talented, and he turned me inside out a couple of times. But it was fun to play. You know, a lot of times when you play against players like that, you know, you step up to the challenge because you want to play better. You want to show, in particularly when we played in Winnipeg against the Jets, because I grew up 40 miles from there, so I had a lot of people from my hometown there. So you'd always want to have the best showing you could, you know, in front of your friends and family.
And while Joe Daly got a lot of play with them in the pipes, in the nets for Winnipeg, they also had a guy named Ernie Wakely who had NHL experience. Of course, he had a couple guys playing in front of him with the St. Louis Blues, Hall of Famers Glenn Hall and Jacques Plante, so there wasn't much playing time there. He came over to Winnipeg and later played with the Houston Aeros. Those are a couple of guys that come to mind, helping the Jets climb up the ladder and show their supremacy in the WHA.
The competition between the Winnipeg team and the Aeros was as good as it could get, because it wasn't just about the talent, it was about the difference in the style of play. You know, the doggedness, corner work that a lot of our guys would do versus the free skating, you know, fast breaking style of the Winnipeg team.
The Jets were ahead of the curve, if you will, because they added the Swedes like Ulf Nilsson, Anders Hedberg, and Lars-Erik Schuberg. and they had the great Bobby Hull to go with them right from the start. But then after the Arrows folded, they added players, quality players like Morris Lukowich, Rich Preston, and Terry Ruskowski. When the Arrows folded, they added some pretty good players to the stock there, and that helped the Jets stay atop of the WHA.
As the Europeans started coming into the league, their puck patience and the way they played the game started to affect the way teams approached the game. And certainly we're no dummies here in Canada. We learned that our way is not necessarily the best way all the time, and we've taken the good parts of the European game and put them into ours, and it makes for much better hockey. And I'm so happy that that happened, because I would hate to think of our league over here now if the Europeans had not come over to play and help us make the game better.
And I hope the players in hockey realize what Bobby Hull did for them, jumping to the WHA, causing the salaries to be increased. Because I think the baseball players don't give enough credit to Curt Flood for what he did, what he sacrificed by fighting the reserve clause in baseball.
But I did hear that the WHA actually, when Winnipeg won the Avco Cup that year, they actually challenged the NHL, and the NHL wanted nothing to do with the Winnipeg Jets. And I think if you went and talked to a few NHL people who got a chance to watch some of those Winnipeg games, they would have been very impressed with it. They would have been in the top tier of the NHL teams.
But they were fun to play against. They were always high-tempo games. The puck was moving, and you were always challenged as a defenseman. So you were able to raise your level of competitiveness to play against them.
Really, when I played against Winnipeg, when I was with Indianapolis, I was amazed at actually how good they were.
Those Winnipeg teams, they were as good as teams as there was in professional hockey. I don't care what anybody says.
The three-time Avco Cup champions, the Winnipeg Jets.
The Jets had the puck in their own zone. I think the Crusaders had dumped it in off the opening draw. Hull's line had started, and that very play developed. And Schoberg fired it ahead. Nilsson got it, made a quick move, fed it over to Hull. And from just outside the blue line, he wound up with that wicked curved stick of his and took a slap shot. Jerry Cheevers did the splits to make the save, and the puck grazed the post. And the crowd erupted. It was exactly what they'd paid to see, and the game was 11 seconds old. This was exciting hockey.